I've done 3 of the privilege of the faith. I've had 2 answered, 1 in 6 months and 1 in about 8 months, which is really remarkable. Because the Petrine privilege can take sometimes 3-4 years to get that one through the system. And I don't know why, but that's the way it is. Probably because they want to do it in favor of the faith, right? But that's what happens. The next one is what we call a prior bond commitment. What do you think that was? That it wasn't their first marriage? That the person that is filing for the annulment with their first spouse was living at the time that their new marriage was put together, was recorded. And the question of how that marriage came about. Did they get married in the church or in front of a minister? Were they both baptized? Did they have a dispensation? Those kind of things. If it was a valid marriage, then it falls into what we call a prior bond. So what we see in this case quite often is somebody that's got 3 or 4 marriages, and their first marriage cannot be declared a prior bond, but the second, third, and fourth marriages can be declared a prior bond. And then you have to find out everything in the world there is to know about the first marriage, whether that was a legitimate marriage or not, and if it can be annulled within the process of declaring the sacrament null. So it's what we call a documentation case. Who got married when to who, and who's still living, who's not living, and those kinds of issues that go down. Yes.
If the spouse dies, then none of this makes any difference for a remarriage.
As long as there was no other marriages involved.
Okay.
If there was multiple marriages involved, the one that we worry about the most is the first marriage. If that spouse is still alive and their second and third spouse died, that doesn't matter. The first marriage is still valid unless we can prove that it was invalid. So a prior bond usually means multiple marriages involved already. More than 2.
But we are talking about annulment for the second marriage. What if the person is in the second marriage and she is or he wants to get annulment on the first one? How this goes? I mean, it's the same way, there has to be something different.
Yeah, we have to go through this whole process to declare that first marriage
Wasn't
invalid.
valid. Yeah.
But that just takes care of what we call lack of form,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Prior bond is in there.
Yeah.
Natural law is in there. If we get 2 people that come in, they're both obviously male, or 2 obviously females, and they're married, and they say, well, that marriage was never valid to begin with,
Right.
because it's a violation of natural law. That's a simple documentation case, unless there was a sex change operation in the
That's a
process,
very good go.
which is it happens today. It didn't happen, when in '83 so much when the Code of Canon Law was revised, but
So the church has already addressed that issue
Oh,
of
absolutely.
where someone was a male, now the woman is married a guy. That's good.
And they get married in the church?
They judge them on the
they're
terms.
they got married before the sex change happened. So they were obviously a male and a female when they got married, and they fit all of the criteria of what had to happen, and then partway into the marriage, the guy or the girl has an identity crisis and says, my gender's all wrong, and goes in and goes through a sex change operation. Well, that doesn't affect the marriage because it happened afterwards.
Right, right.
But if it's obviously 2 males or two same sex come in and say, we're married, you can say, no, you're not.
Oh, I wanted to see him go get an annulment after that one. I married a woman and he is now a he. I want an annulment. I know divorce would be relatively simple.
Go ahead, Vern.
In listening to those questions, and I might have missed something, it seems like the sacrament of matrimony is closely related to the sacrament of baptism, but nothing much so on confirmation or Holy Communion, which are really the practicing Catholic
Mhm.
sacraments.
Yes, it has a lot to do with baptism.
Yeah, because
Because for a sacramental marriage to occur, at least one person within the marriage has to be baptized.
But where does confirmation being confirmed Catholic and practicing Catholic? Holy
In
Communion?
terms of the Pauline privilege, or where one party is Catholic, the Petrine privilege, the favor of the faith, one party has to be Catholic, one has to be unbaptized. And the person that is Catholic has to be a practicing Catholic in order for the annulment on the non-baptized person to be effected. Okay, so if that person is not a practicing Catholic, then why would you want to have a favor of the faith? It's just going to be like I'd be marrying two people that had no business being in the church to begin with.
So
At least
then
one of
what's-
them has to be
What's the formal definition of a practicing Catholic?
baptized, First Communion, confirmation, and that they attend church on a regular basis. That's a practicing Catholic.
If one party that starts off as a valid marriage, all the conditions are met, that one party renounces belief systems, and then as a result, the marriage falls apart.
The sacrament of marriage occurs at the time of the marriage,
Right.
not 5 years after the marriage has been
Right.
done. So you have to look at what was going on at the time of the marriage, leading up to the marriage and immediately following the marriage, a very small period of time. And that's when we look at what we call consent issues. Now we have 14 issues that would make a person's consent invalid. And those would be a grave lack of discretionary judgment concerning essential marital rights and duties. That's one. At the time of the marriage, you or your spouse was affected by some circumstances or factors that seriously impaired your ability to understand and evaluate your decision to marry, and your ability to create a true marital relationship with each other. So there has to be some outstanding situation that impaired your judgment, right? Because then it impairs your consent. You're not really 100% free to marry. So what could those kind of things be? Somebody that's an undeclared alcoholic, right? And you find out on your wedding day that he is an alcoholic, or 3 days after the wedding that she is an alcoholic. I don't want to pick on the guys all the time. So you had no knowledge that this was it. He did a great job of hiding it, or she did a great job of hiding it. You just didn't understand why they were buying so much mouthwash. I don't know. So there's a lot of things like that. Or somebody that had a pornography addiction, right? That you didn't have any clue about because you never saw his laptop or her laptop until you got after the fact of marriage, right? And then suddenly you began to see a pattern. And you said, oh, this has been going on for a long time. Okay? So those kind of things, you made an error in your judgment about the person, or your judgment was impaired by something was hidden from you, so therefore you cannot give your consent freely to that you do not know. Second one, a psychic natured incapacity to assume marital obligations. At the time that you are married, you or your spouse suffered from a debilitating psychological or emotional condition that it made it impossible to fulfill the normal obligations of marriage. What are the obligations of marriage? I promise to be true to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, right? I will love you and honor you all the days of my life. We will accept children willingly, right? Those type of issues, those are the normal obligations of marriage. So these are psychological or psychosis issues, maybe is the better word of using it, that would nullify the marriage right off the bat, okay? Let's say a person did not disclose that they were bipolar. That would be a disqualifying condition for marriage. You didn't know about the person having that illness. Well, how do you prove that? Well, I finally got to look inside the medicine cabinet after we got married and use an alarm or something, you know? So, well, are you going to tell me about all this stuff? When were you going to tell me about all of this stuff? So there's a necessity to hide something from the spouse that makes it an invalid marriage. But it has to be of a psychic nature, psychological nature. Something else that would be in there would be somebody that would be a chronic liar.
That'd be man, period, right?
No, not necessarily. Believe me, I've seen them both ways. Error about a quality of a person. This is another one. Error about a quality of a person. You or your spouse intended to marry someone who either possessed or did not possess a certain quality. Example, social status, marital status, education, religious conviction, freedom from disease, or freedom from an arrest record. Again, these are situations where something was hidden from you or and not disclosed until a short time after the marriage. At the time you married, you truly believed that the other party did or did not possess that quality, but in reality, you were mistaken. Okay? So this would be, somebody mentioned, you know, all of a sudden you're in a situation, the person isn't practicing their faith anymore, has completely changed in their outlook on morals or those kind of things. Can you trace that back to an error in the quality about a person? Was it something that was in play at the time that the marriage took place, the day of the ceremony? Just previous or just after? Something that wasn't disclosed. Fraud. You or your spouse was intentionally deceived about the presence or absence of a quality in the other person. And the reason for the deception was to obtain marital consent. It has to be that the reason that the fraud was enacted was to make sure that you got to marry him. Okay? What would be an example of that? A phony millionaire, right?
All these guys that are bilking women out of their money.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm at least 18. The next one is called a determining error. You or your spouse married with the belief that the state had the absolute power to dissolve or end your marriage, that any marriage could and should be dissolved under certain circumstances, and that remarriage was completely acceptable after a civil divorce. So you got married with the idea, well, if this doesn't work, I'll just get a divorce. The state's got the overriding right, not the church, in the determination of the sacrament itself.
So this is enough to the divorce?
Get an annulment.
Yeah.
Yeah. But how do you prove that? That's the trick, is it's harder to prove some of these things than other things. Well, how do you prove, well, I got married thinking I could get a divorce. That's not a problem. Well, part of the process is that you have to have people that will corroborate your story. You have to contact them, they put them under oath and deposition, just like in a court, and they have to fill out these questionnaires. They go to a group of 3 judges, and that determination is made by that group of 3 judges. They call it a tribunal, a bishop and a priest, and either another priest or a lay person, or a nun, or some vowed religious. And in the proceedings, they have what they call the defender of the bond, which is that person's whole job is to say, no, my gosh, this is a sacrament. And that's their whole job, is to say, this is a sacrament, prove that it's not. So it's not as easy as it appears to, especially on that kind of a ground, because it's like, well, yeah, I can produce 4 of my best friends, I can take them out, have a few beers, and they'll say anything to me, you know? That's not how it works.
It seems like it would answering that would contraindicate your being a practicing Catholic.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, you can't, I mean, how could you be both?
Right. You'd be surprised at what you run into.
No, I wouldn't. Remember what I did for a living.
Yeah.
Nothing surprising.
A total willful exclusion of marriage. Wow, that's a big mouthful. You or your spouse did not intend to contract marriage as marriage is understood by the law of the church. Rather, the ceremony was observed solely as a means of obtaining something other than marriage. For example, to obtain legal status in the country or to legitimize a child.
Ow. Ow.
Ow, that's right. So we would be able to declare a marriage invalid if, let's say, somebody, and I don't want to pick on Muslims, but I'll pick on Muslims, or somebody from South America would come in and they needed a green card, or they needed some way that the state would say you can remain in this country. And so the two of them are good friends, they go to school together or something, they decide to get married strictly for the purpose that that marriage would allow that person to stay, and then they promptly get a divorce within days after they get their green card or whatever. That constitutes fraud. And therefore, they did it for a reason other than for the sacrament. So the sacrament is invalid. There's something wrong with this freedom to do this.
Okay, but in situation when there was the motive for them to do that, and then they actually fall in love and they happily live forever, is this marriage valid or not? If they don't want
How
to-
long does the marriage last? And the conditions for the fraud is that after the marriage takes place, the condition is very quickly resolved with, they got their green card, or they got, you know, this happened, or this happened, or this happened, and then a divorce came very, very quickly. If they remain married,
Right.
well, then what we call the persistence of the marriage would prove the validity of the sacrament. People don't like to hear this, but marriages that last 25 or 30 years are very hard to get an annulment for because the marriage has persisted. Okay. Do they happen? Sure, they happen, but it's more and more difficult as time goes on. Okay?
Which
Well-
doesn't seem entirely fair, because you took your vows to say that you were a lifelong commitment, and then
If you're trying to do that.
somebody walks out, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
agreed.
yeah.
But the first thing that they're gonna look at, this person they call the defender of the bond, is, did the marriage persist? Well, it can persist and still have faults. It can still have consent issues that go on with it. You just have to figure out how you're gonna dig that consent out, what those issues are, and then trace them back to very early in the marriage. So usually, that's the other reason that sometimes these lengthy ones, long-time marriages happen, that they're difficult, is because a lot of the witnesses are gone. Right? People that get married in their 60s and 70s, for example, that want to get married in the church and they have a previous marriage, they have a lot of work to do to find out who's still around of their crowd that they ran around with that can testify to the validity of the marriage or not. Willful exclusion of marital fidelity. Okay, that one is, get that, your head in there, marital fidelity. You or your spouse married intending intending when you got married, either explicitly or implicitly, not to remain faithful. I'm gonna have an open marriage. How many times did we hear that in the 60s? Oh, I've got an open marriage, right? Yeah, anybody want in? Willful exclusion of marital permanence. You or your spouse married intending either explicitly or implicitly not to create a permanent relationship, always retaining the option to divorce.
That's not a true marriage then.
That's not a true marriage. No. I'll do this until it's inconvenient. As we're going through this, you have to remember the process itself. You have to fill out a questionnaire. You have to write a biography of your marriage, basically. What happened, when? Why are you going after this ground or this other ground or two grounds? Because you can have multiple things that you are filing under for this annulment. And you go through all of this, but you have to be able to prove it, that these conditions were real and not just something in your own mind. Well, I saw the handwriting on the wall, so, you know, those kind of things. It has to be something that will stand up in front of this tribunal that is going to judge. And you have to have other people that can say, yeah, we're aware that these problems were going on. And they get questionnaires, and then they compare them all together and see if they all add up. And then they may do it, and they may not. It depends on if they think that there's other extenuating circumstances that would make it still a valid marriage. Because the assumption is always going to be that the sacrament is valid. That's the starting assumption in each and every case, is that the marriage is valid. That's why we have a defender of the bond. A future condition. We have a future condition, a past condition, and a present condition. Three different things. A future condition. You or your spouse attached a future condition to your decision to marry. For example, you will complete your education. Your income will be at a certain point. You'll remain living in this area of the country. That's a future condition. I'll marry you if, right? This happens within 5 years of our marriage. That's why one of the questions that we ask is, are you having any limits on your consent to this marriage, and do you have a prenuptial agreement? Okay. Well, some prenuptial agreements are valid. It's your spouse died, you've got a large estate, you've got 3 kids, you want to make sure that the children from that previous marriage are taken care of, and so a prenuptial agreement may split assets between those children, and the church would say that that's okay. But if you go in and the prenuptial agreement says, well, if you stay married to me for 5 years, I'll give you 10% of my estate, and if we stay married for 10 more years, then you'll get 20% of my estate. If we stay married for 50 years, you get 100% of my estate. Then you're putting a future condition on the marriage, right? I'll marry you if this happens. A past condition. You or your spouse attached a past condition to your decision to marry, and that condition did not exist. It has to not exist, right? I will marry you provided you have never been married before. That's a past condition. It's a valid one, but it's a past condition, and they hide it, right? I will marry you provided you have already graduated from college. And so you go ahead and get married, and then you find out, oh no, I used paintbrush, and I've got this nice diploma that I did on my own on my printer at home, right? I really didn't graduate. That's a past condition. A present condition. You or your spouse attached a present condition to your decision to marry, and that condition did not exist. I will marry you provided that you don't have any debt. Believe it or not, that's one of the leading causes of marriage breakups right now, is that the amount of financial debt in the marriage is not disclosed faithfully to each other prior to the marriage. And they suddenly find out that each one of them is carrying $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 worth of student debt into the marriage, and they didn't tell the other person about it. Or they have 15 credit cards that are up to the max, and they're paying 18% or more on each one of those cards. And suddenly they get married and they says, well, why don't we have any money? Oh, you didn't tell me that you had $60,000 in student debt. You didn't tell me ahead of time that you had, I never would have married you if I knew that you were that financially irresponsible. Okay, so and that's part of that marriage preparation that we talked about last week. We try and get them in that process through the focus inventory and through the marriage preparation programs to disclose those things to each other during that process so that they can make a valid decision or a valid consent to the marriage, to go in with their eyes wide open. Force. You or your spouse married because of an external physical or moral force which you could not resist. What would that be?
Daddy shotgun.
Daddy shotgun, a perfect example. That's a physical external force.
And a moral one too.
Well, the moral one might be, I'm pregnant,
Right. Yeah.
right? You're gonna marry me because I'm pregnant. And you'd be surprised how many times that happens, only to find out, well, you're not really pregnant?
Or you're not really there.
Yeah, that too. Force. Fear, that you or your spouse chose to marry mainly because of fear, and that fear was grave and inescapable and was caused by an outside source. So an outside source causing you a great fear. My mom and dad, from day one, when I was 3 years old, told me that I had to be married. And that if I didn't, that they would disown me. That's fear. If you get married because of some force being put onto you, you're not really freely giving your consent. Now, these are what we call formal cases or defective consent cases. And they're a lot harder to work with than, say, a prior bond or a lack of form or those kind of things. These will take anywhere from 18 months. I've seen a couple of them go 4 and 5 years with multiple times saying, I have new information. I have new information. You were denied. Oh, I've got more information now. I've got more information now. So it continues. So they can take quite a while. They're quite lengthy. And they just take a lot of work and detail to get through those. How many are granted, how many are not granted, I can't give you an exact number. A lot of them are granted because they're pretty much cut and dry. This is what happened, I've got the proof, and we submit it and it happens pretty rapidly. But there are ones that persist for a long period of time. Questions? It's very clinical, sorry, it's very clinical approach, and I'm sorry that that's the approach that I have to take on the whole thing, is that what are the facts? Let's talk about what's real and what's not real.
Yeah, it's sort of something that bothered me or concerned me, a question about the fear. I had a friend who told me something that I still haven't figured out to this day. He's getting married to this woman, and all of his friends, me included, said, there's no way she's ready to bed bugs, there's something wrong with her, what are you doing? And he said, it has nothing to do with her. It has to do with the fact that I'm in love with the idea of marriage. Now, that's not that's the opposite of fear, but it seems to me that he wasn't marrying her for her, he's marrying her for some external reason. Would that not be
willful exclusion of marriage is what that category would be, is that it's not contracting marriage as the church understands marriage. Marriage is this partnership of the whole of life between two people, that covenant. Yes?
Is that the reason for a large, percentage of people leaving the church?
They feel that they cannot participate in the church because of their divorce. That's the biggest reason. Or that their annulment, if they filed for an annulment, it has not been granted, and so they seek communion, and that has to be another source. Yeah, that's one of the biggest reasons. We had an explosion of divorce, and you can't adjudicate that much that fast, number one. And number two is that people, there's been a fundamental change where people do not view marriage, especially on the younger side anymore, of what marriage really is as a sacrament. And so therefore, sacraments are sacraments. That's all there is to it. And you have to figure out what to do with it. People keep holding out hope that the church is going to say, well, if you're divorced or remarried, you can go to communion. Hasn't happened yet. I don't think it'll happen in our lifetime, but they keep talking about it. Sometimes they say, well, we'll deal with it the way that the Orthodox churches do it, which is the first divorce is a matter for the confessional. The second one is a matter of annulment. So in the Eastern churches, you can get a dispensation from your first marriage through a process of penance. I don't know. I'm not Orthodox enough to know whether that works or not.
But the Orthodox is not that way.
For me, it's kind of strange to leave church just because I cannot God annulment. I mean, you still can go and practice all except communion. If you leave this church and go to another one, what do you have instead?
That's right.
This is
And I agree with that 100%, but people do it. People do it in droves because they say, if I go up for a blessing instead of going up for communion, then they're making me feel different. And this idea of what's just and what's not just has lost its meaning in our society. And that's an issue, that's a problem.
This issue can be addressed by education. I mean, during the school, I mean, my kids went through the school. And when we came here, my youngest daughter, she was, there was her first few years in here. And she went through First Communion with her first. And she followed what actually she learned at home from us, parents. And I remember that after First Communion, during the school mass, she was few times in receiving communion, and then she stopped. And she was asked by other kids, you are not Catholic, why you are not going to communion? And she said, well, I need to go to confession because this is what happened. She felt that she needs to go. There was no confession on daily basic accessible. So, you know, she wait for us for certain time to go. But I believe this is kind of showing how different understanding could be, and why education is needed also in this case. If you tell others, kids at the school, they went through Catholic school, and during the services at church, listen, this is a sacrament. This is what you need to do.
And I'll tell you that you are an exception in the education of your children. But I will also tell you that 60% of the parents in the Catholic Church right now do not participate or feel that they have to participate in the education of their children in the faith. And it's not just in this country, but it is the reason that churches are being emptied worldwide. And the education of the parents, we have a generation that is not catechized and not evangelized. And that group stops at about age 50 and starts on the bottom end at about age 20. And this whole center section has not been evangelized enough by the church, but also never evangelized by their parents. Their parents have been too busy earning two incomes, doing this and doing that to participate in the educate. I get very passionate about this because there's so many children that will be in 5 sports throughout the entire year, but they can never be brought to, by their parents, brought to religious education, or brought to the church for the sacraments, or brought to Sunday Mass because they have a tournament. And I get frustrated with that aspect as much as I get frustrated with the number of people that come in and want to get married that have no business getting married in the church to begin with. So, you know, what do you do? And we got to end this. It's almost 11.
I need to have that. When I went to priest and asked about health, I was told it is your responsibility. That I cannot do it, the parents need to. And I think parents cannot teach kids if they don't know by themselves.
Agreed.
So I believe church should put more stress on this education. And this is not you parents have to do.
No, and I understand that, but we do. We offer that religious education faithfully. And just a second, every year I offer, when we're doing confirmation